I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing on reviewing the Department of Defense strategy, policy, and programs for countering weapons of mass destruction. Before we get started, I want to introduce and thank our four witnesses before us for their contributions on this important issue. First, Ms. Theresa Whelan, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The Honorable Al Shaffer, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and the current Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. Vice Admiral Timothy Szymanski, the Deputy Commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, now the Coordinating Authority for CWMD. And last but not least, Mr. Vayl Oxford, Director of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Welcome to everyone. Over the past few years, both Russia and North Korea have employed chemical weapons nerve agents. In Syria, pro-regime and ISIS forces use chemical weapons on civilian populations to achieve their tactical and strategic objectives. Advances in biotechnology, synthetic biology, and gene editing are rapidly changing the playing field to allow countries and individuals acting with nefarious intent, or even just by chance, to produce biological agents in a scope and scale not yet encountered. And adversaries are working on the development of hypersonic weapons to deliver warheads faster, possibly faster than our ability to counter them. All of these advances are exacerbating the complexity of the world's WMD threats. Indeed, the current coronavirus outbreak and global panic underscores how important scientific research and preparedness across the interagency is for our national economic security. Our four witnesses hold positions that comprise the bulk of the Department's assigned roles and responsibilities associated with aligning CWMD policy and strategy and programs, executing those programs, delivering current and future personal protective equipment and other capabilities to our warfighters, and eliminating our remaining U.S. stockpiles of lethal chemical agents. So I'm told that our witnesses have been directed by the Office of Management and Budget not to speak today to the FY21 President's budget request, despite this hearing taking place after the budget was released yesterday. For the record, I'm deeply disappointed by this directive, which violates longstanding precedent regarding congressional oversight. We have much to oversee on policy, programs, and strategy, and that oversight will be limited without a full understanding of the FY21 budget request. I look forward to hearing about the Department's activities to manage and counter the threat of a drastically morphing CWMD landscape. This year, we tasked GAO to review the preparedness of U.S. forces to counter North Korean chemical and biological weapons on the Korean Peninsula. GAO has already highlighted many unsettling issues. Most pressingly, we question whether U.S. forces Korea planners have access to the relevant intelligence on North Korean chemical and biological weapon sites needed to effectively plan and, if necessary, conduct counter-WMD operations. I'm deeply concerned with our preparedness for a significant state-level WMD event is wholly inadequate. We owe it to the men and women in uniform to ensure that they are trained and equipped to successfully operate and perform in a contaminated environment. In closing, there's much work to be done to strengthen CWMD policy, programs, and preparedness. This includes understanding the 2014 strategy in the context of today's threat landscape, the budget request's alignment to the current strategy, and how the Department's strategy and end states are consistent with the national-level strategy and whole-of-government effort. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and note that following this discussion, we'll move to a closed classified session. So with that, before we turn to the witnesses, I would now want to turn to Ranking Member Stefanik for any comments she may have.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The intent of this first subcommittee posture hearing of the new year is to review the Department's strategy, policy, and programs for countering weapons of mass destruction. As I've stated previously, while the DOD faces urgent challenges daily, we can never afford to lose sight of the critically important mission of countering weapons of mass destruction. This is especially true given recent events as we respond and contain the global impacts of the coronavirus virus outbreak. This evolving threat should serve as a reminder for how important our involvement is in this arena through activities like the Biological Threat Reduction Program, nuclear, chemical, and biological preparedness plans, crisis response exercises, and the development of sound policy that guides our collective response to these types of events. And most importantly, it should serve as a reminder that events of this magnitude require a whole-of-government response, not limited to just the 4 DOD organizations represented here today, but inclusive of HHS, the CDC, DHS, State Department, and state and local officials. The relationships that you build with these agencies and the repetitions in times of peace will underpin the effectiveness of your partnerships in times of crisis. I appreciate the relentless efforts of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, U.S. SOCOM, OSD Policy, Acquisition and Sustainment, and countless other organizations to prevent, prepare, and respond to CWMD events around the globe. While our collective conscience hopes that these weapons will never be used to wage war in the future, we need only look to the Syrian, North Korean, and Russian regimes for proof that this is not the reality of the world we live in. The pursuit, proliferation, and potential use of weapons of mass destruction remains a high-consequence threat that we must plan for. Finally, I'm interested to hear from our witnesses today how recent efforts to streamline and provide additional leadership and accountability to this problem have matured. I'm also interested in any lessons learned from the Department's response and contributions to the coronavirus efforts, and how these insights are evolving our CWMD posture and our view of the criticality of the domestic industrial base and the strategic national stockpile. And while I know we are not going into specific FY21 budget numbers today, I ask each of the witnesses to highlight any specific interest items relevant to the discussion today that the committee should be focused on during our reviews of the President's budget request. Thank you to our witnesses, and I yield back to the Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stefanik. We'll now hear from the witnesses and then move into questions and answer session after that. I thank all of you for the contributions you're making to our national security. And with that, I'd like to recognize Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Whelan to begin.
Good afternoon, Chairman Langevin and Ranking Member Stefanik and members of the subcommittee. I am honored to testify today regarding the Department of Defense's countering weapons of mass destruction efforts. The DOD CWMD Enterprise's mission to dissuade, deter, and when necessary, defeat actors who threaten or use WMD against the United States or our interests, and to be prepared to respond to and mitigate the effects of WMD use is, as you both mentioned, extensive and complex. Mission success requires the expertise and collaboration of many DOD components. OSD Policy develops CWMD policy, strategies, and implementation guidance to ensure the effective development of capabilities and activities. OSD Policy also leads related interagency and international engagements. The threats of WMD use and proliferation are rising. All of the National Defense Strategy's 2+3 actors, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations, have or are pursuing WMD capabilities that could threaten the United States or U.S. interests. Further, the WMD threat landscape is continuously changing. Rapid biotechnology advances are increasing the potential, variety, and ease of access to biological weapons. Converging enabling technologies such as artificial intelligence heighten concerns about these developments. OSD Policy works with DOD components and other departments and agencies to raise awareness and develop strategies to mitigate potential threats, while ensuring the United States is postured to realize the benefits offered by emerging technologies. Through proactive collaboration and coordination, the Department leverages the distributed nature of its CWMD expertise to address WMD threats across the mission spectrum, from preventing acquisition and proliferation, to containing and reducing threats, to responding to WMD-related incidents and contingencies. The DoD CWMD Unity of Effort Council is our collaborative and cross-cutting venue for raising awareness of issues, identifying shortfalls and opportunities, and driving towards solutions. In 2019, the Council focused on 4 primary issues: 2 on the potential use of pharmaceutical-based agents as chemical weapons, 1 on joint force readiness for a Korea contingency, and 1 on enterprise-wide prioritization. The Council also continued working issues raised in 2018. I want to conclude by highlighting OSD Policy's work to advance the 3 NDS lines of effort in the CWMD context. The first is restoring readiness through lethality. One of our primary objectives is to ensure that our forces can operate and win in a CBRN-contaminated environment, which denies adversaries the benefits of using WMD. Even before its charter was signed, the CWMD Unity of Effort Council began working with Indo-PACOM to review CWMD-related readiness requirements and ensure it is prepared to meet them. The Council actively monitors DOD progress towards meeting requirements and, where appropriate, is addressing identified shortfalls to ensure our forces are more agile and lethal. OSD Policy is also working to reform the Department for greater performance and accountability. To ensure the best return on investment, OSD Policy is leading an effort through the CWMD Unity of Effort Council to prioritize WMD threats and provide related policy guidance for the Department to organize DOD CWMD operations, activities, and investments around a cohesive threat picture. The CWMD Unity of Effort Council prioritization anticipates DOD components will align their prioritization efforts. For example, OSD Policy will incorporate the Council's WMD prioritization guidance into our cooperative threat reduction methodologies. Finally, a core tenet of many of our CWMD programs is strengthening alliances and building partnerships. Through work to reduce WMD threats, the Department's CTR program empowers partners to detect, prevent, and reduce WMD threats on their own. This reduces the burden on DOD resources, allows for greater interoperability, and reduces WMD threats worldwide. The DOD CWMD enterprise's agility and expertise will enable us to address the existing and emerging WMD threats of 2020 and beyond. Thank you for your continued support for our CWMD mission, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Whelan. Secretary Shaffer is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting us to testify on the Department of Defense's efforts to counter threats posed by weapons of mass destruction. I have prepared a written statement for the record, but in the interest of time, I would like to highlight just a few key points for you now. While the department-wide efforts for countering weapons of mass destruction have many key players, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, which I am charged to lead, is responsible for developing and fielding capabilities to deter and defend against the use of weapons of mass destruction, and to provide the means to respond effectively should these weapons be used. In that effort, we work very closely with each of the panelists before you, as well as other DOD, interagency, and international counterparts to provide the U.S. forces these capabilities that they need. I think it is instructive to provide the priorities of my office. As I said, my office is the office responsible for developing and fielding capabilities for defense against chemical and biological weapons, and for the safety, security, and modernization of the nuclear deterrent, in partnership with most offices in the Pentagon. Consistent with the National Defense Strategy, our highest priority is maintaining the viability and modernization of the nuclear triad as an effective deterrent. At nearly the same level, we aim to ensure that no soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine is harmed by chemical or biological weapons, and specifically to increase emphasis on the emerging chemical and biological warfare threats that we are seeing come into the field now. Our third major priority is to accelerate the destruction of existing stocks of old chemical weapons, the stockpile of our chemical weapons, and to develop the capability to safely dispose of chemical weapons and biological weapons our forces might encounter in hostile environments. Finally, we need to continue to emphasize rebuilding an effective and diverse workforce to be able to handle the threats of the future. We're in an interesting time for countering weapons of mass destruction, as the convergence of another number of scientific disciplines, including artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, molecular engineering, and system-level autonomy, are opening the door for development of new challenges. Whether it is Russia or China upgrading their nuclear forces with new and advanced nuclear weapons, or the use of novel chemical weapons in 2018 in the suburbs of Salisbury, England, threats from WMD continue to evolve, modernize, and expand. In many ways, we have thrown off the old norms. In particular, I am very concerned that as the norms against the use of weapons of mass destruction continue to erode, those seeking to develop novel chemical weapons or push the boundaries of biology and genetic engineering for nefarious purposes continue to expand. I look forward to discussing these issues with the committee. In closing, I will continue to work with my interagency stakeholders, my partners around this table, and our international allies to provide the capabilities to deter, confront, and defeat the use of weapons of mass destruction. Our nation and our forces deserve this. I appreciate the committee's continued support for these efforts, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Shaffer. Admiral Szymanski is recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to appear before you today on behalf of the U.S. Special Operations Command in its role as the Department's coordinating authority for countering weapons of mass destruction. Special Operation Forces have a long-standing operational role in countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As coordinating authority for countering weapons of mass destruction, SOCOM is also responsible for coordinating across the joint force to conduct campaign planning, assess execution of the campaign plan, and make recommendations to the Department leadership. In this coordinating authority role, SOCOM relies on the guidance and partnership of the distinguished Department leaders here at this table. Our work is nested tightly within National and Department policy and strategy as conveyed by the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security to ensure unity of effort with the rest of the Department and U.S. government. We partner closely with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs to support a robust nuclear, chemical, and biological defense posture for the Joint Force. And the Defense Threat Reduction Agency supports as a combat supporting agency, providing timely information sharing, intelligence and planning coordination, and technological solutions for the Joint and Special Operation Forces. In the 10 months since I last updated you on SOCOM's work as the coordinating authority, world events have driven a number of changes in the landscape of nuclear, chemical, and biological threats. While other changes continue to evolve in ways that are harder to measure, additionally, SOCOM remains focused on countering the global threat from violent extremist organizations. But the command and coordinating authority role have oriented to also address great power competition. What has not changed is the need for informed, coordinated action across the U.S. government and a close relationship of trust with our partners and allies. As DOD coordinating authority, our goal is to position the Department to support just such coordinated action and nurture those key relationships to prevent the emergence of weapons of mass destruction capabilities, protect the United States and its citizens and our national interest from threat actors either developing new or advancing existing programs, and respond to and mitigate the effects of any use. I refer you to my written statement for additional information regarding our approach to this mission and look forward to your questions. In closing, I would like to thank the members of this subcommittee once more for their support of this important national security mission. It is a privilege to work together with Ms. Whelan, Mr. Shaffer, and Mr. Oxford every day to keep our country safe from nuclear, chemical, and biological threats. I look forward to our continued partnership with them, with members of Congress, and with our interagency international partners to ensure our safety now and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Szymanski. Director Oxford is now recognized.
Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your continued support to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I'm pleased to join my colleagues appearing before you today. They represent the key leaders in the department to counter the threats associated with weapons of mass destruction. I also am proud to represent the men and women of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, an agency that in the last year was designated as the Mission Assurance Center of Excellence for the Department based on our vulnerability assessments of defense-critical infrastructure around the world. We advanced the development of advanced nuclear weapons effects to help STRATCOM as based on NPR requirements. We participated in a New START treaty mission in the exhibition of Russia's newest strategic delivery system, the RS-18 Variant 2 ICBM Avangard, that is designed to deliver the hypersonic glide vehicle that is to be nuclear capable. We expanded the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning to a variety of our data analytics efforts, to include applications to build 3D models of underground facilities based on intelligence and geospatial data. Our integrated munitions effects assessment was designated as the enterprise solution for supporting the warfighter for combating weapons of mass destruction and hardened and deeply buried targets. Catapult, our mission-driven data analytics platform that integrates over 1,100 data sources, was approved as a program of record. Continued support with CENTCOM and SOCOM was necessary to counter Iranian nuclear ambitions and to continue to pursue the de-ISIS campaign and to confront the Taliban threat in Afghanistan. Since appearing before you last, the agency has continued its pivot towards the goals of the National Defense Strategy and to confront the ever-complex and dynamic threat environment composed of state, non-state actors, along with their proxies and surrogates. This environment places increasing demands of working across DOD, the interagency, and with international partners. Further, the adversaries we have faced have spent decades developing globally connected networks, requiring us to adopt global partnerships and a global perspective to fully identify the threat networks associated with China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK. To address this global nature of the threat, we have amplified our partnership with U.S. SOCOM to take on additional support for the geographical commanders responsible for dealing with these adversaries. Beginning in 2018, I directed a full bottom-up review of the agency's programs and personnel to make sure that we were aligned and focused our efforts on strengthening the nuclear deterrent, tailoring our support to the conventional force, and evolving our counter-threat network capabilities from a unique focus on VEOs to a threat-based focus on all the adversaries in the National Defense Strategy. In doing so, we recognize that we must confront and overcome several key challenges. Scaling our network analysis approach from the de-ISIS, Taliban, and al-Qaeda threats to a globally connected nation-state threat. Recognizing that actions against nation-states to compete in the gray zone requires a different decision calculus than countering terrorist networks, thus necessitating even closer relationships with the combatant commanders, OSD, the Joint Staff, the interagency, and our international partners. And most importantly, recognizing the need to more fully understand the intentions and motivations of near-peer competitors. I'll close with two recent examples of long-term efforts paying off in significant ways. First, the CTR program's biosurveillance program work with Thailand enabled their officials to detect their country's first case of the novel coronavirus outbreak, thus helping them mitigate further spread of the disease. Second, the FDA recently licensed the first and only Ebola virus disease vaccine made possible by DITRA Research and Development, with hundreds of thousands of doses now administered across the U.S., the EU, and Africa. It is protecting health care workers, reducing the allure of Ebola as a threat agent, and better protecting the warfighter. Again, thank you for your support of the agency, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Oxford. Members will now be recognized for 5 minutes. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Secretary Whelan, how is the Department thinking about biotechnology and synthetic biology and other non-traditional materials and capabilities that could be used to cause mass destruction?
Thanks, Congressman, for the question. Actually, this is a very important issue, and we're glad that you're raising it and raising the awareness. It's one of great concern to us that we have been looking at from a policy perspective, and I will let my colleagues also comment on what they are doing specifically in their areas of expertise. We have actually funded the National Academy of Sciences to do a study for us on the changing nature of biodefense threats and potential security vulnerabilities to give us some overarching perspectives on it. But we are very concerned about the linkage between new biotech capabilities and new computer-based AI, artificial intelligence, that can enable and lower barriers to access capabilities to use new biotechnology in nefarious ways. So this is something the department is concerned about, and I will ask my colleagues if they would like to comment on what they're doing specifically to address the issues.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, when we look at the nefarious ways that synthetic bio could be used, it can be used to direct modifications to the human genome, allowing for new pathogens to be created. Known pathogens can be started from scratch without a lot of advanced warning. They can engineer and produce novel pathogens that have never existed before. We can make pathogens more dangerous, more transmissible, more virulent in their makeup. Within the agency, working with Mr. Shaffer's NCB office, we've undertaken several different initiatives to counter this threat. First of all, we're increasing our hazardous assessment of emerging threats based on large data sets to inform future capability development. We're developing new hazard prediction models with data produced from threat agent science. We're also developing detectors capable of detecting broad levels of emerging threats. Similarly, developing diagnostics to rapidly provide the warfighters assessments of the threats they face. We're also developing medical countermeasures to start to address some of these novel agents that may appear on the battlefield in the future. Those are just a few of the examples of what the ChemBio Development Research Program that we execute on behalf of Mr. Shaffer's office is attempting to satisfy.
Thank you, Director. Secretary Whelan, there's been increasing attention to disease surveillance and response globally, particularly as the coronavirus crisis accelerates. A global biological pandemic would arguably present the single biggest threat to the U.S. short of a nuclear war. Considering the ongoing response to the coronavirus, what are you learning about the gaps in the Department's ability to respond to large-scale biological events, whether man-made or naturally occurring?
Thank you, Congressman. So we we're actually still in the middle, obviously, of supporting our colleagues, particularly at HHS and DHS and CDC, in responding to the coronavirus. And certainly within DOD, our Health Affairs Office has issued some of its own guidance to the force for their health protection. We are still assessing how this could impact us more broadly. We have our offices, Northcom and our defense planning offices have looked at planning for pandemics. We have faced this problem before with H1N1 back about 10 years ago. So we are obviously, and then we recently faced it looking at Ebola in West Africa. So we are constantly absorbing the lessons learned and using them to address our force protection. But let me turn to Mr. Shaffer for some of his comments.
Particularly interested in learning about the gaps in the Department's ability to respond to.
Sir, I think that we're, as Theresa said, as Ms. Whelan said, we are still in the middle of analysis. I have the Defense Logistics Agency that comes underneath my portfolio. They're involved every day in a whole-of-government approach in telecom and emergency response meeting. They're gathering up where we are with respect to ability to fulfill the supply chain. I do think we have to look at ability to mass-produce vaccines and develop and mass-produce vaccine in a very short order. We have to balance some of the FDA restrictions on rapidly deploying vaccines with the help that they will give. But I think it will take some time to deconstruct where we saw the specific gaps in the supply chain. My job is worrying about the supply chain, and then in other parts of the policy response. We are committed to doing that, and I will come back with a supply chain answer after we have a chance to analyze it.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Oxford, any comment?
So, Mr. Chairman, one thing I would bring to light is what we talked about when we talk about synthetic bio, and couple that with the announcement that was made last night with the Chinese hacking Equifax. If you couple that with the other hacking they've done over time of Anthem, Marriott, et cetera, OPM, the large database that's being created in conjunction with what we do in outsourcing our genetic engineering to the Chinese because it's cheaper, you can imagine what the potential outcomes are. So we ought to be looking at this as not necessarily a dangerous spread, but we ought to be looking about it from what we can understand about transmissibility and those kind of things in case there were a separate kind of outbreak.
Good. Thank you, Director. Ms. Stefanik is now recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Oxford, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program has been a valuable tool that DOD uses to proactively reduce the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction through partnerships with foreign countries. And in fact, I have had the opportunity to learn more about those as I've led congressional delegations. Last year, Congress increased the amount authorized and appropriated by $35 million. Can you explain the return on investment of the CTR program and also explain its importance nested under the National Defense Strategy?
Yes, thank you for the question. And again, when we receive ads like that, what we do is we sit down with Mr. Shaffer's office, Ms. Whelan's office, and we go through a prioritization across the globe to make sure we're applying those in the most applicable way. Since I took office, I've made an emphasis of not only accounting for the National Defense Strategy priorities, but also working more directly with the combatant commanders to make sure we're operating in the right locations within their geographical areas as they understand the region better than we might in D.C., just to make sure we're putting the right pressure points on the system. So I think what you found over time when you go to places like Jordan, when you see the Philippine Coastal Watch Center, and what I mentioned about the work that we've done on Thailand that identified the coronavirus very quickly, there's value added throughout the world with these programs.
Next question is for Mr. Shaffer. This is somewhat of a follow-up to the chairman's question. Obviously, in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak, concerns have been raised that the strategic national stockpile isn't sufficiently prepared to deal with emerging diseases. There are legitimate concerns about shortages of medicines, health supplies, surgical masks, and vulnerabilities in our supply chain when the manufacturing of these items has moved to China. So how is DOD building resilience into its stockpile of chemical and biological supplies, and what are we learning from this particular instance with the coronavirus experience?
Congresswoman, that is a terrific question. As I tried to explain, we're still in the process of understanding where our gaps and shortfalls are. I think we all recognize that we've had, not just in the chemical biological agent area, but in a large number of areas, we have outsourced our manufacture of critical equipment. You talk about chemical biological effects. I look at microelectronics, where we don't have nearly enough indigenous capacity. I think that's a nationwide problem. We're going to come back and take a look at what we have to do for chemical and biologic defense for our troops. And then getting beyond that, we will work with CDC and other departments or other parts of government for a whole of government response. My concern really is for our troops that we deploy and making sure those troops and the families that are with them have the protection that they need, have the right antidotes, have the right protective gear. But it is something I think we all have to step back and take a look at. Are we prepared for this type of event?
And the reason I emphasize it, I know it's repetitive of the chairman's question, but it's really important to learn the lessons. And there's concerns on both sides of the aisle to make sure that we apply what we're learning today of these shortfalls and make sure that we address it in the future. Admiral, SOCOM has now been the coordinating authority capacity for 2.5 years. Can you explain SOCOM's view, how SOCOM views this responsibility, and what specific actions the command has taken to better coordinate countering WMD activities across the department?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with the second half of the question first on the coordination piece, because I think since we briefed you last year, we've actually aligned with the NDS in concert with my great colleagues here at the table, but we've been able to take, as if you recall, our functional campaign plan is based on a model of pathway defeat from, in the opening statement from Secretary Whelan, from acquisition to use. We've been able to take key objectives and tasks and lines of efforts in that and build that into the global campaign plans of 3 other combatant commands. 2 of those are still in draft, but two of the threat actor nations that the other geographical combatant commanders have that global campaign response for across the lines of prepare, protect, and respond. So that's one. We've been able to actually integrate some of the concepts, the key tasks and objectives into our global integrated exercises that the chairman's using, and we've been able to develop a common operating picture with the great help of DITRA on all of our DOD-wide operations, activities, and investments to see that in real time on the Joint Staff's common integrated COP. What was the first part of your question, though? I answered the second.
You know, you're 2 years into being the coordinating authority. It was broad how you view this responsibility and then what specific action. So I think you covered it, and we can get more into detail in the closed session. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Larson is now recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Shaffer, soon after coronavirus was discovered, the Chinese mapped the genome and blasted that out to the scientific community so that folks would start working on diagnostics and vaccine development. Now, the diagnostic kit was developed fairly quickly, but the vaccine is probably 4 months away, 5 months away from test, and probably a year away, or maybe slightly less from being okayed. Can you? What role are you all playing here in the United States, maybe with CDC or without, to kind of facilitate a solution on that? And then what's the broader lesson as well?
Thank you, sir. So I think you hit it in your question. The role of the Department of Defense is to support HHS and CDC in developing a vaccine. We won't take lead in that. We will make our facilities available for test, but we are in support role for the greater health emergency. I do think we have to take a look at lessons learned. At how long does it take to create a vaccine that can be used, and then how do we think about taking time out of that equation? And I think that's something we're all going to have to discuss over the next coming months. There are ways to cut some time out. It comes with risk, and everything, it's like everything, it's going to be a risk versus value assessment. But we need to look at taking time out, and we will support the CDC in every way possible.
Okay. So Mr. Oxford, the downside of this is that the genome of the coronavirus was mapped pretty quickly and blasted out the rest of the world. And you probably saw that and said, oh no, I've got to do something in defense about this. As opposed to offense, create a vaccine, you've got to figure out what this might mean for defending against its use against anybody, including our folks. How have you all approached that at DITRA?
So again, you know, our posture this time versus the Ebola outbreak is really to be in support of HHS. That they have a lot of leadership there that didn't exist in 2014, so they have taken the reins on this. What we are looking at are things similar to what I mentioned before, is if this were a different kind of virus that posed a lot more serious consequence, what should we be doing at that point in time? Mr. Shaffer has hit on this as well, that, you know, one of the things, if you're in the offensive chemical business, you develop countermeasures alongside of that. We don't have that luxury, so what we've got to do is get it out in front of it with the science, as I mentioned before, looking at what the potential emerging threats are and starting to look at broad-based medical countermeasures ahead of the threat. In the closed sessions, we can talk about some of the other research that we know are going on and what measures we're already taking because we know they're happening.
Yeah. So coronavirus presumably is a natural biothreat, but synthetic drugs like fentanyl aren't. And so I think we can probably all relate as members of Congress in our districts to the opioid crisis and the role that opioids play, including fentanyl. But that's as a domestic crisis. Are you looking at fentanyl as a bioweapon, a synthetic bioweapon, and what steps are you taking?
Absolutely. In fact, we've done this, again, in conjunction with the Kim Defense Program under Mr. Shaffer's guidance. Since we were last before you, we've actually done field trials with Live Agent. We've done it here in the U.S. as well as with the Brits in the U.K. I can tell you in the open session that the results of those tests say that fentanyl is about equal to VX in terms of its lethality. Carfentanil is 1,000 times. So if you reverse that, what that means is a lot less agent to cause the same kind of damage as VX. We also know that the materials fentanyl and carfentanil will persist in the environment, soil and water, for weeks to months. So it's not something that just goes away as chlorine will. So it poses other challenges for long-term operations. We can talk about force protection and some of the other features in the closed session.
Yeah. And then in your testimony and in our discussion in the last couple weeks, you talked about the transition more from threat-based to network-based, looking at threats to more networks. Can you discuss any of that in this open session?
Sure. We can talk a lot more in the closed session. One of the things I would go back to some of the other questions about getting out in front of the exporting of capability, for example, to China. We need to be looking at the supply chain network, both incoming and outcoming from this country. We need to identify what components others may be relying upon U.S. technologies that we want to identify up front, as well as what they may be exploiting within universities and those kind of things. So there's a lot there that the network analysis will illuminate, as the ranking member mentioned. What this does is allow us to use the authorities of the interagency like Commerce and Treasury to act on information the Department of Defense can develop.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Mr. Conaway is now recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panel, thank you all. Turn to something a little more mundane, but could we get an update on our chemical demilitarization program? It's had a couple of non-McCurdy breaches in the last 8 years. We've got another $1 billion spending this year. Are we going to make the 2023 deadline? And I guess that's Ms. Shaffer. You look like you were about to answer that. Can you give us a status on that overall program?
Yes, sir. We will make the December 2023 deadline, and we will actually beat it. We have a new program manager that we put in place of it. When we get upstairs, I will have a placemat to put in front of you. The destruction has gone up remarkably in Colorado at the Pueblo Arsenal, and we have started destruction in Bluegrass in Kentucky against the other major stockpile. We're also bringing online three additional static detonation chambers. Layperson, you can think of, we heat the thing to such a degree that it vaporizes the entire munition. Yeah, we're going to make it.
On budget?
Oh, absolutely. Right. We will not be asking. Well, it depends, sir, on our original budget estimate or what we have right now. We will make it on the budget estimate for right now. Okay. We will not go higher.
And the other question was, the report each year said you were looking at accelerating or ways to accelerate the destruction, and that's what you're talking about there with the that you may get in ahead of time.
Yeah, so we've done a number of things. We're bringing on additional static detonation chambers. We're working with the local state environmental agencies to increase our throughput. We're going to 24-hour operations in some cases, and the increase in the rate of destruction of the existing stockpile is remarkable. I think as of a year ago, we were somewhere under 20%. I have Dr. Charles Ball behind me, who's responsible for this. Within the next couple of weeks, we'll be over 50% destroyed at Pueblo.
All right. Good news. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. Ms. Houlihan is now recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Shaffer, my first question is for you. It's my understanding that the GAO completed a report about 5 years ago that established that the department had made progress at researching, developing, and making available medical countermeasures against biological threats, but did not use its established process for annually updating its list of threat priorities. From there, it's my understanding as well that the department concurred with the GAO's findings and identified steps to address their recommendations. Can you, in this environment, possibly share with us what the department has done over the last few years to implement a process to ensure that the biological threats list is prioritized appropriately?
So, ma'am, I hate to say this, but 5 years ago, I was departing the department, going for a great 3 years in Paris, and no one has talked to me about this GAO report. So Let me take this one for the record and get a better answer back to you.
Thank you. I would appreciate that one.
Yeah.
And my second question actually sort of relates to that as well. I'm concerned that we don't give enough attention to biological and chemical weapons and spend a lot more time thinking about nuclear threats than we possibly should. And I'm just trying to make sure that we have what are we doing to make sure that we think about these issues and that we are addressing these in an adequate way? How are we making sure that we're having adequate investments in biological threats and that we're not spending our time in threats that are potentially antiquated in some ways?
Yes, ma'am. I presume that's for me. So I will answer this in kind of a broad perspective. When I took over responsibility, I looked at where we were, what our investment priorities were. I had to hire a new Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for chemical biological defense programs. My charge to her was we have got to increase emphasis on non-traditional agents. Non-traditional agents include fourth-generation nerve agents, they include pharmaceutically based agents, and they include biological agents from either genetic modification, synthetic biology, and that like. Her job is to increase our investment, shift our investment portfolio. I have run that up through the leadership. This will be crass, but one of my first tasks to her, I'll clean it up, was by this April develop a scare the heck out of them briefing for senior leadership within the department. We'll be happy to bring it over to you. When we get into the classified environment, the things that we are seeing are among the most worrisome that I have seen. I came on active duty, I shouldn't tell you this, in '76. I am concerned with where the threat space is going. And
So,
she's
sir,
got to get it right.
So, sir, I'm deeply concerned as well, and I did not come on active duty in '76, but rather in '89. But these are the things that keep me up at night. Do you feel as though the President's new proposed budget adequately kind of reflects these priorities and where the threat currently is, vis-a-vis nuclear versus biological, versus chemical?
So I will tell you that the President's budget does have a fairly good investment for chemical biological programs. Within that portfolio, I have tasked Dr. Van to shift the emphasis. We can do some of that within the year of execution. I'm actually really targeting fiscal year 22 to come in with a significantly altered investment profile. We are where we are, but we're going to work it very hard to get the profile right.
And do you think proportionate to the nuclear threat that the President's budget is a good representation, an accurate representation of our concern, the things that keep you and I up at night?
So my answer will probably surprise you. Yes, it does, only because of what I'm seeing also in the nuclear enterprise in China and Russia. We're seeing just really, really aggressive behavior in all three forms of weapons of mass destruction, from those nations, from Iran, from North Korea. So I have a hard time parsing out any particular weapon that could kill literally hundreds of thousands of people. It could be chemical, it could be biological, it could be nuclear. All three are very, very challenging threats.
And you would probably be surprised as well to hear that I'm also concerned about all of those three threats, and I just want to make sure we get it right.
Good, so
Spend
do
the
I.
right kind of resources. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Scott is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we talk about countering these threats, it's obviously not just the U.S., but our partner nations that are helping us counter them. And Mr. Oxford, you mentioned the Chinese hacking Equifax. There's public reporting that China has threatened Germany, Denmark, and France that if Huawei is discriminated against or not selected in the development of their networks, that there will be retaliation, economic retaliation from China towards companies from those countries. We've seen the UK move forward with Huawei network integration. That's obviously a concern for many of us on this committee and throughout the United States. And we expect that Other nations, obviously, some have chosen not to and are being threatened. Some will choose to use the cheaper solution. My concern is with regard to intelligence sharing and the potential exposure of sources if we share across with an ally that is using the Huawei network. So my question, Mr. Shaffer, I guess is for you. When we talk about acquisition efforts with the United Kingdom or with other partner nations who are using Huawei or other companies that we deem to be not safe for us to transmit sensitive information through, what issues do you see moving forward with these types of bilateral engagements with countries that are our friends and partners if they're using Huawei to design their networks?
Sir, the use of Huawei by our closest allies and friends is a concern. There's an awful lot of activity going on at the diplomatic level. If we do not believe a nation can protect information, we will not share it with them. And I think anything else we say is probably best saved for the closed session. Okay. But you hit upon a very strong concern. It's a strong concern by Secretary Esper. It's a strong concern by both myself and my boss. And when you look at the convergence of digitization of data with artificial intelligence that Mr. Oxford just talked about, there is a substantive threat to the nation. And I'll just leave it at that.
I'll accept that, and I'll just make one further statement. I mean, hacking is something that you expect from a rogue nation or from a terrorist organization. China is one of the largest nations in the world, one of the three most powerful nations in the world. The fact that they conduct themselves this way is of great concern to me, and I know the committee as a whole. And I'll leave it at that and wait until we go behind closed doors. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Bacon is now recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thought I wasn't next in line. First of all, I appreciate all of your expertise here today.
Mr. Bacon, I misspoke. I apologize.
Okay.
Mr. Gallagher is now recognized for 5 minutes.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yep.
Okay.
4 minutes. I assumed it's because Bacon's a general and I'm just a captain. But
my apologies.
It's fine. It's fine. How much? I don't know who to direct this to. Possibly to Mr. Shaffer. How much have recent advances in synthetic biology and our ability to sort of literally print organisms, right? We're not just talking about CRISPR, rearranging the ATCs and Gs. We're sort of printing sequences of ATCs and Gs. There's sort of a commercial market for that. Give us a sense of how that's changed the threat picture and where we are relative to the Chinese in that space.
So I will tell you, I have a very good staff. I am not the biological expert, but my understanding is that the U.S. still leads in these technologies. But there's an awful lot of information, intellectual property flow to China. We know the Chinese are very good. We know that they're using advanced techniques. I think it's something we have to monitor very closely. And the whole business of academic freedom and academic research coupled with national security is something we all have to think about in the information age. What's the risk payoff benefit between total openness of information and ability to do very exquisite data mining? And this is something I think we, as a technologist, I can explain where the opportunity is, where the threat is, but we're really opening up a really significant policy debate, sir.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone on the panel has thoughts on, I mean, we're seeing the emergence of companies that are manufacturing and printing organisms right now, which is stunning. And to what extent does DOD think about that as an area where we need to invest further? I just open it up if anybody does study these issues.
I think similar to the question that Ms. Whelan asked before, I mean, there's plenty of money in chem-bio research. It's a matter of focus. So I think it's a matter of what is our purpose for getting into that field versus what the Chinese and others may be doing. So I think it's really a matter of focus and intent that we've got to look at. We would be doing this for the right reasons. They may not. So I think it's really the focus that I would go to.
Quickly, and this may be relegated to classified session, but to what extent when we war game scenarios on the Korean Peninsula, are we including the assumption that the DPRK will initially use biological and chemical weapons? For example, the thousands of artillery pieces that are built into Quezon Heights that can range Seoul will be armed with chemical and biological weapons. Is that a worst-case scenario we plan against? Do we plan against it at all?
Congressman, yes, absolutely. I mean, we have to be ready to operate in a CBRN-contaminated environment. And in fact, our readiness to operate in such an environment, we believe, hopefully is a bit of a deterrent to the use. If we can show that no matter what you throw at us, we're still going to be able, our forces are still going to be able to operate effectively, we think that might actually serve as a deterrent. But yes, we do plan for that. More detail would have to wait until the closed session, but it is absolutely on our radar screen.
And just one quick follow-up, and I do hope we can follow up in classified session. I mean, it's one thing to allow our troops to operate in such an environment, but when you're dealing with the second largest metropolitan area in the world, I mean, there are limits to our ability to minimize civilian casualties in such a scenario, correct?
Yes, there are. That's
okay.
correct.
Well, with that, in an effort to get to the classified session, I will yield the minute and 2 seconds I have left.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Ms. Slotkin is now recognized 5 minutes.
I apologize. I'm just coming in, so I'm going to yield my time and just listen because I don't want to take us off track.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Bacon is recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise today to our great panel. I have 3 questions. I'm going to try to direct them and try to keep the answers succinct, if you would. My first question is to Ms. Whelan and Mr. Shaffer. If a WMD attack or accident occurs, the United States may need to be able to treat massive numbers of casualties quickly. This would likely create a demand on emergency and medical services that would overwhelm local and regional available resources. And so, like UNMC, or University of Nebraska Medical Center, we have a great capacity to treat bio-emergencies, and we're trying to expand upon that. So my question is to Ms. Whelan and Mr. Shaffer, what are we doing to ensure that we have the capacity at the national level to effectively respond to a WMD skill event in terms of medical facilities, beds, and specialized training? Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. So on the DOD side, we actually have a CBRN response enterprise that we have put together over the last 2 decades. And we've got about 18,000 plus, give or take, active and reserve forces who are trained to be able to support the local first responders and obviously FEMA. We work through FEMA at the national level and would only be engaged, at least with our federal and reserve forces, through FEMA at the national level. At the state level, obviously, the National Guard can come into play under state authority. So we are prepared to support if there is a domestic event.
Mr. Shaffer, anything else to add? Okay. My second question is to Admiral Szymanski and Mr. Oxford. At the University of Medical or Nebraska Omaha, we have the National Strategic Research Institute, which is a university-affiliated research center that is focused on technologies for detecting and countering nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, as well as disease outbreak. Can you speak to the importance of these kind of university-affiliated research centers in building our ability to detect and respond to WMD events?
Congressman, I think one of the things that would be interesting is we've used the center in Omaha to actually attract future talent. We fund some of the research out there. We've also used some of the staff expertise within the office to actually help us start to war game some of the advanced threats. For example, we just ran a limited nuclear war game within the agency to find out what challenges we may have confronting, for example, Russian use of nuclear weapons. It was talent that was out at the facility that we actually used.
I think generically to all those affiliated universities, SOCOM uses a number of universities for different aspects of the SOCOM's enterprise and its portfolios. And just recently, we conducted a conditions-based assessment or an overall assessment of our sensitive activities going forward. We can talk a little bit more about that. But we would not be able to get some of the analysis and the research done required otherwise without those affiliated universities.
Our University of Nebraska is very proud of what it does, and they'd want to continue supporting DOD. While Mr. Oxford's here, I'd like to just piggyback on some questions on open skies. Can you give us an update on the open skies mission? You know, it's been a little bit under the microscope lately, and I'm a big supporter, but I'd like to get your update.
Sure. Thanks for the question. First of all, last fall, working with the Joint Staff Policy and the National Security Council, there was a determination made to actually increase the strategic value of every mission that we flew. So we've actually, without going into detail, we have started places within and over Russia that we hadn't before. We just completed a mission in late January that we'd never flown in January before. So this is a matter of using the strategic nature of the treaty that may not have been used the way it should have for the last 20 years. We have another mission going on right now, so back-to-back missions. And if we fly all the missions currently planned this year, it'll be the busiest open skies season ever.
Great to hear. What is the value of open skies to our allies? Because I think that's an area that we're missing in our discussions.
So you know, when we talk about leaving open skies, we have a lot of consultation with our treaty partners, and they've been universal in the need for this dialogue, this ability to do that, and the ability again to continue to put pressure on Russia. I was at UCOM last week. We were talking about UCOM's European strategy for 2020. And it's clear NATO is coming together like it hasn't in many years as a community worried about Russian influence and the ability to push back on Russia is becoming more of a NATO issue. So these kinds of our capabilities, I think they find very valuable.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. I believe all members have had the opportunity to go around one round of 5-minute questioning. So with that, there are no additional questions. We're going to recess now and move to the closed session.